Something takes hold when you've been emotionally abused for a long period of time, and you start to isolate yourself. In my head. You know those days when you just want to be left alone, you don't want people around you, you don't feel good. Maybe you've known a friend that kind of started to duck out of life. This could be a sign of emotional abuse. I want to talk about that. Sometimes when we've experienced emotional abuse, particularly ongoing emotional abuse, we isolate ourselves. And sometimes that's because the person who's abusing us is actually trying to get us to isolate ourselves. So we need to talk about emotional abuse and isolation, because when we're undergoing emotional abuse, sometimes the person is trying to control us. They're trying to isolate us from people. That gives them more power over us, and it makes us more likely to suffer. Now, I always like to remind everybody that emotional abuse is a pattern. Everybody does something that's emotionally abusive every now and then. Emotionally abusive things are like name calling, silent treatment and stonewalling, invalidating somebody, gaslighting, and we all do this to some extent, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally, but it only becomes emotional abuse when it's a pattern and it's done over and over and over to somebody. Now, when it comes to emotional abuse, most of us can get away from it in some way. You know, if somebody name calls us or they say something online to us or whatever, we can block them, we can get away from them. But the times when emotional abuse becomes a problem is when it's somebody in our vicinity, a friend, a family member, somebody that we work with, somebody that we go to school with, people that we really can't escape. Now, when we're in these situations, the person might outright tell us, you're not allowed to tell anybody, and this is a problem because abuse in general, it thrives in isolation. When you're not telling other people, that person gets more and more control over you. So them telling you to not tell people is a way to control you, and it's a way to isolate you. They'll probably couple this together with a threat. So they'll say something like, if you tell somebody that I'm going to hurt you, if you tell somebody that I'm going to tell people your dark secrets, they'll have some kind of blackmail, or they'll threaten that if you do tell people, they're not going to believe you, they're going to shame you, and some of that might actually be true. But not all emotional abuse is going to happen this way. It can happen very gradually. There may not be any threats, and the person may actually gain your trust, you know, especially in the case of an intimate partner relationship that you have with somebody. You've learned to get to know them over time, you've learned to like things about them, you have shared memories and experiences, and the threat becomes the loss of those shared memories, those experiences, those things that you were looking forward to, and the love that this person gives to you, or at least the love that they were giving to you. You might find that this person over time gradually is trying to get you away from your friends, to get you to distrust them, to get you to hang out with them more often so that they can isolate you. You might find that they start telling you lies about your friends or things to make you mistrust them, and then you might also find that they're spreading lies to all your friends to get them to not trust you. The problem with all of this isolation is that it doesn't just happen because of the other person. Something takes hold when you've been emotionally abused for a long period of time, and you start to isolate yourself. When you repeatedly hear negative messages about yourself, or you get implied negative messages by the way that somebody's acting around you, they start to repeat in your head. You start to think, I'm a bad person, I'm terrible, I'm ugly, whatever it is. There's all kinds of different ways to describe yourself in a bad way. That starts to repeat in your head unconsciously, and it starts to wear down slowly at your self-esteem. Once your self-esteem is lower, you're going to naturally isolate yourself from your friends. You're going to naturally want to be home alone, because you're going to start to see people as fearful, you're going to start to see people as distrusting, and you're going to start to see yourself as not able to connect to people, not able to do the things that you normally would do in life. And part of that is because of a system that we have in our bodies. It's a neurological system called the panic and grief system. We first attach to people through the care system in our body. It's another neurological system that allows us to bond with people. And once we have that bond, we have this panic grief system that kicks in. And we know this because we've seen this in birds. You know, when a mother bird flies away, the baby birds, what do? They cheep, they cry, they want them to come back out. And you can see this in human babies too. When the mother goes away, the baby cries out because the baby wants mom close. But we have this same system set in place when we form friendship bonds with people, or we form romantic bonds with people. And when we see them pulling away, we cry out. We want them to come back. This is why we feel loneliness when they're not around. But what happens when somebody is consistently not there for us? What happens if the mother bird dies, for example? We go into grief. So you have the panic that activates when somebody that you love is missing, when they're gone for a while. And then you have grief when there's no response, because you can't panic forever. Your body can't stay in that heightened anxiety state. So eventually it sets in that this person has been lost, and we have to start the grieving process and feel sad about it. Sometimes when we're in an extended period of grieving, when we cry out and we cry out and we can't find anybody that can help us, like might happen in these isolation situations where our friends, they don't trust us anymore, our family doesn't trust us, we're backing away from people maybe are hurt that we're backing away from them, and so we're disconnected from people. And even though we cry out, we start to give up, and what happens sometimes is depression sets in. Once depression sets in, it's a lot easier to control somebody and to manipulate them, because they're not going to be motivated to take care of themselves. They're not going to be motivated to do the things that most people do. And so when they're being emotionally abused and they're being isolated, depression sets in. That's when you're at your most vulnerable. We also see that depression can sometimes come about during PTSD. And in fact, one of the symptoms of PTSD is blaming yourself and feeling like you're responsible, feeling like you're a bad person, and feeling like you can't trust other people. So that isolation all comes about because of that. PTSD may happen because you're experiencing emotional abuse over and over and over again, and that can be life-threatening. When you're isolated from other people, you're dependent on one person who's constantly abusing you. That's life-threatening, and that could bring about PTSD. Those are trauma symptoms. Now, the problem here is when we have these symptoms, sometimes we want to avoid the thing that caused the trauma, and we don't want to experience it. We kind of block it out. Sometimes we deny it, and we think that the person abusing us is actually helpful, and we think that they're our friend, and we think that we have to depend on them. And what we're really doing is we're blocking out that fear and that emotion of, oh my gosh, I'm in an unsafe place. And that's partly why the depression might be setting in. But the problem here is that that's an avoidant strategy. You're avoiding the trauma. You're avoiding working on what's keeping you where you are. And that may be good to help you survive in the moment, but long term it is really bad for your mental health. What we need to be able to do then when we're in these situations is to get away from the person who's emotionally abusing us, to take proactive steps, to start to combat that depression, to feel like we have some sense of autonomy, to start to find people that we can trust, to get out of this isolation. And probably the best thing that you can do is to contact a domestic violence shelter if you're in a place that's dangerous. If not, get to see a therapist. A therapist will be somebody that you can trust who can help you out of this situation. Now, that doesn't mean that the relationship that you're in is in danger. It doesn't mean you have to get rid of a family member. It might, but it doesn't mean that you have to. Chances are you're probably not using boundaries with this person. Maybe you tried though. Maybe you tried and it failed, and that was your crying out. And that was them not hearing your cry. So what you really want is to get a third party involved, somebody who can look at the whole situation, figure out if what you're really experiencing is emotional abuse, if it is trauma symptoms. Maybe get two people involved, maybe not rely on one person, don't make that mistake again. But a therapist, of course, is the best person that you could have on your side. And just be aware that if you try to use boundaries on somebody who's emotionally abusive, there's a good chance that they're not going to respect that boundary. So don't rely on that to be your savior. Don't rely on working things out with them to be the end-all be-all, because they're the way they are for a reason. You got to where you are for a reason. You need some extra help to get you out of this. If you want to learn more about emotional abuse, I have a YouTube channel. Go to youtube.com/RyanLiberty and hit subscribe. I do this to humanize mental health. If you want to support me on that mission, head on over to Patreon. I'll put the links below. Now, I'd love to hear from you. If you had this experience before, what tips would you give to somebody who's going through this kind of emotional abuse and isolation? Leave those down below so we can discuss and share, learn from each other. As always, thank you for coming out here with me. I'll see you around next time.